A young hotshot director insulted Dean Martin's acting abilities in front of the entire crew. What happened next became legendary in Hollywood. It was March 12, 1971, on Soundstage 9 at Paramount Studios. Dean Martin, now 53 years old, stood in the shadows watching the controlled chaos of a major film production. The movie was something big, a Western comedy that was supposed to revitalize his film career after a string of disappointing pictures. But as Dean observed the young crew members setting up equipment, he couldn't shake the feeling that many of them saw him as a relic from Hollywood's past. By 1971, the entertainment landscape had completely changed. The Rat Pack era was over. Frank Sinatra was struggling with his own career challenges, and a new generation of filmmakers had taken over Hollywood. Directors like Francis Ford Coppola, George Lucas, and Martin Scorsese were reshaping cinema with gritty realism and innovative techniques. Meanwhile, Dean Martin was increasingly viewed as a representative of the old guard, a crooner who had gotten lucky in movies but couldn't adapt to the new artistic standards of serious filmmaking. The director of Something Big was a 29-year-old hotshot named Michael Brennan, who had made his reputation with two critically acclaimed independent films. Brennan was part of the new wave of auteur directors who believed that Hollywood's golden age had been built on style over substance, and he made no secret of his contempt for what he called the old song and dance men who think acting is just showing up and looking cool. Brennan had lobbied hard against casting Dean Martin in the lead role, arguing that the film needed a real actor who could handle the dramatic requirements of the script. But the studio executives, nervous about the commercial viability of yet another artistic experiment, had insisted on a bankable star. Dean Martin, despite his recent box office disappointments, still carried enough name recognition to guarantee international distribution. From the first day of production, the tension between Dean and Brennan had been obvious to everyone on set. Brennan treated Dean with barely concealed disdain, speaking to him in the condescending tone typically reserved for difficult child actors or aging has-beens. Dean, for his part, maintained his characteristic cool professionalism, but those who knew him well could see the frustration building behind his calm exterior. The breaking point came during the filming of the movie's most crucial scene, a dramatic confrontation between Dean's character Joe Baker and the film's antagonist. It was a complex sequence that required Dean to convey years of pent-up anger and disappointment through dialogue and subtle facial expressions. The scene was designed to be the emotional centerpiece of the entire film, the moment that would prove whether Dean Martin could handle serious dramatic material. Brennan had scheduled an entire day for the sequence, planning to shoot it from multiple angles with extensive rehearsals and numerous takes. He'd made it clear to the crew that this was where they would either capture something special or confirm his suspicions that Dean Martin was incapable of real acting. The first run-through was a disaster. Dean, perhaps sensing Brennan's negative expectations, seemed tentative and uncertain. His line delivery was flat, his movements awkward, and his emotional moments felt forced and unconvincing. Brennan stopped the scene after just 2 minutes. "Cut!" Brennan called out, his voice carrying across the soundstage. "This isn't working at all." Dean walked back to his starting position. But Brennan wasn't finished. "Look, Dean," Brennan said, loud enough for the entire 70-person crew to hear. "I know you're used to just showing up and reading lines in those lightweight comedies you've been making, but this is serious filmmaking. This scene requires actual acting, real emotion, genuine character development, not just that cool guy persona you've been coasting on for 20 years. An uncomfortable silence settled over the soundstage. Crew members stopped what they were doing and looked around nervously. In all their years in Hollywood, many of them had never heard a director publicly dress down a major star like this. But Brennan was just getting started. "I mean, let's be honest here," he continued, his voice growing more contemptuous. "You're a singer who got lucky in movies. You've never really learned how to act. You just stand there looking suave and let your natural charm carry the scene. But charm isn't going to work for this character. Joe Baker is supposed to be a man dealing with real pain, real failure, real human emotion. That requires acting skills you simply don't possess." Dean stood in the middle of the set, his face showing no emotion, but everyone present could feel the electricity in the air. This wasn't just a creative disagreement between a director and his star. This was a public humiliation designed to establish Brennan's authority and put Dean in his place. The assistant director, a veteran named Tom McCarthy, who had worked with Dean on several previous films, tried to intervene. "Mike, maybe we should take a break and discuss this privately," McCarthy suggested diplomatically. "No," Brennan replied firmly. "I think everyone needs to understand what we're dealing with here. We're trying to make a serious film, and we've got a lead actor who peaked as a nightclub entertainer. Dean, I'm not trying to be cruel, but you need to face reality. Your acting abilities are limited, and this scene is beyond your skill set." Brennan turned to address the crew directly, as if Dean weren't even there. "This is what happens when studio executives prioritize box office appeal over artistic integrity," he announced. "They saddle us with actors who can't deliver what the material demands. We're going to have to figure out how to work around these limitations and still make something worthwhile." The insult hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Dean Martin, the man who had conquered nightclubs, television, movies, and recording studios, had just been dismissed as a talentless fraud in front of dozens of his peers. For a long moment, Dean didn't respond. He stood perfectly still, his hands at his sides, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he walked over to where Brennan was standing next to the main camera. "Michael," Dean said quietly, using Brennan's full name instead of the casual Mike that everyone else used, "you think I can't act? I think you've had a successful career based on your personality and your connections." Brennan replied, doubling down on his criticism. "But real acting, dramatic acting? No, I don't think you're capable of it." Dean nodded thoughtfully, as if seriously considering Brennan's assessment. "Tell you what," Dean said, his voice still calm, but carrying an undertone that made everyone on the soundstage pay attention. "Let's try something. Give me one chance to run through this scene. No rehearsal, no direction from you, no multiple takes. Just roll the cameras and let me show you what I can do." Brennan laughed dismissively. "Dean, this isn't a nightclub where you can wing it and hope for the best. This is a complex dramatic scene that requires preparation and technique." "Humor me," Dean replied. "One take. If I can't deliver what you're looking for, I'll admit you're right about my limitations, and we can figure out how to reshoot the scene in a way that accommodates my lack of talent." The challenge hung between them like a gauntlet thrown down in the middle of the Old West. Brennan looked around at the crew, many of whom were watching this confrontation with fascination. He realized that backing down now would make him look like a coward, while accepting Dean's challenge would either prove his point definitively or potentially embarrass him if Dean somehow managed to pull off a decent performance. "Fine," Brennan said. "One take. No do-overs, no excuses. Let's see what the king of cool can do when the pressure's really on." The crew quickly reset for the scene. The lighting was adjusted, the cameras were positioned, and the sound equipment was checked. As the technical preparations were made, Dean stood alone in the corner of the set, not rehearsing his lines or practicing his movements, but simply closing his eyes and breathing slowly, as if he were entering some kind of meditative state. Tom McCarthy, who had seen Dean work for years, recognized what was happening. Dean wasn't just preparing for a scene, he was transforming himself into the character. It was a process that most people never got to see because Dean usually did it privately, but now, under the pressure of this very public challenge, he was doing it right there on the soundstage. "Quiet on the set," McCarthy called out. "Roll cameras. Speed," came the response from the camera operator. "Action," Brennan called out, his voice carrying both skepticism and curiosity. What happened next would be talked about in Hollywood for decades. Dean Martin didn't just deliver his lines, he became Joe Baker completely. Every gesture, every expression, every pause was perfect. The pain in his voice when he talked about his failures felt absolutely genuine. The anger in his eyes when he confronted his nemesis was raw and believable. The vulnerability he showed in his quieter moments was heartbreaking. But it wasn't just the emotional authenticity that stunned everyone watching, it was the technical mastery. Dean hit every mark perfectly, delivered his lines with flawless timing, and moved through the scene with the kind of natural blocking that usually took hours of rehearsal to achieve. He modulated his voice, used his body language, and employed subtle facial expressions with the skill of a classically trained actor. The scene required Dean to go through a complete emotional journey, in just 8 minutes of screen time. He had to start angry, reveal his vulnerability, show his strength, display his wisdom, and finally demonstrate his resolve. It was the kind of complex character arc that would challenge any actor, but Dean navigated it with such apparent effortlessness that it looked like he was simply living through the experience rather than performing it. When the scene reached its climax, Dean delivered a monologue about dignity, honor, and the cost of compromise that was so powerful that several crew members found themselves wiping away tears. His final line, "A man's got to know when to fight and when to walk away, but he's always got to know why he's doing either one," was delivered with such conviction and depth that it felt like a life philosophy rather than scripted dialogue. As the scene concluded, Dean held his final position for several seconds, staying in character even after his dialogue was finished. The soundstage was completely silent, except for the quiet hum of the film equipment. Finally, Brennan called out, "Cut!" The silence continued for another long moment. Then, spontaneously, someone in the crew began clapping. Within seconds, the entire soundstage erupted in applause. Grips, electricians, camera operators, makeup artists. Everyone who had witnessed Dean's performance was applauding with genuine enthusiasm and respect. Dean stood in the middle of the set, still slightly in character, acknowledging the applause with a small nod. He looked directly at Brennan, who was standing behind the main camera with an expression of complete shock on his face. "How was that, Michael?" Dean asked quietly. Brennan walked slowly onto the set, his earlier arrogance completely gone. He looked like a man who had just witnessed something that challenged everything he thought he knew about acting and performers. "Dean," Brennan said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I owe you an apology. That was extraordinary." Dean shrugged with characteristic modesty. "I've been doing this for 25 years, kid. I've just been waiting for someone to give me material worth sinking my teeth into." The transformation in Brennan's attitude was immediate and complete. For the rest of the production, he treated Dean with the respect and deference typically reserved for the most accomplished dramatic actors. He sought Dean's input on character development, listened carefully to his suggestions about scenes, and often asked him to help other actors with their performances. Word of Dean's single-take triumph spread quickly through Hollywood. The story became legend, how Dean Martin had silenced an arrogant young director with one perfect performance, proving that real talent transcends generational changes and artistic trends. When Something Big was released later that year, critics who had dismissed Dean as a lightweight entertainer were forced to reconsider their assessments. Variety called his performance a revelation that proves Martin has been hiding dramatic depths behind his casual persona for years. The Hollywood Reporter wrote that Dean Martin's work in Something Big establishes him as a serious actor capable of handling complex material with intelligence and emotional honesty. But perhaps the most telling response came from Michael Brennan himself, who would later tell interviewers, "Working with Dean Martin taught me that experience and natural talent are sometimes more valuable than film school theory and intellectual pretension. He showed me that real acting isn't about showing off your technique. It's about becoming the character so completely that the audience forgets they're watching a performance." The success of Something Big led to a renaissance in Dean's film career. He began receiving offers for more substantial dramatic roles, and directors who had previously dismissed him as a Rat Pack relic started seeking him out for their projects. Dean's single-take vindication had not only silenced his critics, but had opened up entirely new possibilities for his artistic future. Years later, film students and acting coaches would use the story of Dean Martin's Something Big performance as an example of how real talent can triumph over prejudice and preconceptions. It became a reminder that in Hollywood, as in life, you should never underestimate someone based on their public persona or previous work. The incident also changed Michael Brennan's approach to directing. He became known as someone who treated all actors with respect, and who looked for the hidden depths in performers rather than writing them off based on their past roles or public image. Dean Martin's 8-minute single take didn't just save a scene or prove a point. It demonstrated something that Hollywood often forgets, that true artistry doesn't always announce itself with fanfare and pretension. Sometimes the most profound performances come from people who have spent years perfecting their craft in apparent simplicity waiting for the right moment to reveal the full extent of their abilities. The legacy of that March afternoon in 1971 serves as a reminder that talent, like fine wine, often improves with age and experience. And sometimes, when challenged publicly, that talent can explode with a power and brilliance that leaves everyone who witnesses it fundamentally changed. If this story about proving your worth against all odds moved you, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible tales of Hollywood triumph. Have you ever been underestimated and found the perfect moment to prove your critics wrong? Share your experience in the comments below, and remember to ring that notification bell for more amazing stories of talent, determination, and the sweet taste of vindication.